So when I was in graduate school, nobody took habitat fragmentation seriously as a conservation issue. It's because you can't really see the consequences immediately. The consequences are huge, but they accumulate over time. And it was only when Robert MacArthur and Ed Wilson put out the theory of island biogeography to explain why different islands had different numbers of species on them. And then people began to think, well, maybe fragments of forest in a landscape would behave in the same kind of way. People began to think, oh, habitat fragmentation may be a really serious issue. We just had this huge argument going on without any data. I was actually running the program for the World Wildlife Fund in the United States, and I realized until we understood this, we actually didn't know whether any of our projects would succeed in the long term. That's what led me to start the Forest Fragments Project in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon 38 years ago. What we did was, in collaboration with Brazil's National Institute for Amazon Research, we basically worked with 3 ranches, which were at that point continuous forest, but were going to be turned into cattle pasture to some extent. And they were required by Brazilian law at the time to leave 50% of their land in forest. Today it's 80%. And basically we asked them if they would arrange their 50% so we could have this giant experiment. So we did that, and the results are very dramatic. 100-hectare piece of forest, which in English terms is like 250 acres. It's not a trivial piece of forest. But what we've discovered is the birds of the forest interior, the ones that don't like to leave the shade and the darkness of the forest, will not go out into daylight, will not cross a road. We lose half of those species in less than 15 years. Once the piece of forest is no longer part of a continuum, it begins to lose species until it reaches a simpler state, just like a radioactive mineral loses radioactivity. We now know that habitat fragmentation is a really serious issue. And if you flip that around, what it means is we need to be really working hard at putting connections back into the natural landscape. That may seem like a wild dream, but it in fact is easier than one might think. If one is to actually protect the edge of watercourses with natural vegetation, which is in fact the law in Brazil, what that does is put a lot of natural connection back into the landscape. I got to review the Northwest Forest Plan as it was being developed in the Clinton administration, because I was science advisor for the Bruce Babbitt, the Secretary of Interior, so I went out and they were trying to decide at that point how much undisturbed forest would be along the edge of the watercourses, which was a really important question. But as I looked at those maps, I was just astounded by the amount of connection that is being put back in the landscape. So as we think about natural landscapes going forward, how to protect biological diversity, how human aspiration can be served in a sustainable kind of way, what we actually need to do is flip the model from one in which we think of nature as in some little place with a fence around it, essentially a fragment, to one in which human aspiration is actually built into the natural landscape, with much more connections between the relatively intact natural areas. And in the United States, we have these big interstate highway systems that were actually started in the Eisenhower administration. And they can be terrible barriers. There's one northwest of Yellowstone National Park, which is an absolute barrier to the movement of grizzly bear populations. So what do you do about something like that? Well, in fact, if you actually go and look at the law, you can spend interstate highway system money to build wildlife underpasses or overpasses. So I think it's just a matter of thinking differently about all of this, being less focused on ourselves, to looking at all of this as a way in which we can embrace nature and embed ourselves in it and get all the benefits that come from that, whether it's through the library function of biodiversity, or it's an ecosystem service, or it's actually enabling plant and animal species to be able to move in response to climate change. habitat fragmentation is a really, really serious conservation issue in itself. It becomes an even greater one when climate is changing and all the animals that are in some habitat of some ecosystem, the plants and the animals, their natural response will be to track their required conditions. And if, as somebody once said, Philadelphia is in the way, there is no future. Fragmentation is a really bad way in which we've affected the natural world, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't flip it around and think about ourselves as existing in a natural matrix and engage young people in riparian vegetation, building more nature into city landscapes like they do in Chicago with the Chicago Wilderness Effort, which seems like a real contradiction in terms, but the greening that's gone on in Chicago is quite astounding. You look at a city like Washington where we have a lot of green and we have Rock Creek Park snaking through all parts of the city. That's much more in the kind of direction that we need to be going in the future.